It was 3:12 a.m. when my world, or at least the version of it I had clung to, fractured without warning. The glow from my phone screen lit up the bedroom like a whisper, soft yet accusatory. I hadn't meant to fall asleep waiting for him again, but the weight of weeks, maybe months, of silence disguised as routine had worn me down. I reached for the phone blindly, expecting a weather alert or perhaps another spam notification. What I saw instead was a digital receipt, 2 first-class tickets, Boston Logan to Florence, Italy. Departure, next Friday. Passenger names, Daniel Parker, Isabel Monroe. I stared at the email, reading it twice, then again. My heart didn't break all at once. It cracked, slowly, methodically, like ice splitting across a frozen pond. The name Isabel struck me first, not because I didn't know it, but because I knew it too well. She worked at Daniel's tech company, a product manager he'd casually mentioned at dinner 2 months ago. "Brilliant but awkward," he had said, chuckling over a glass of Pinot Noir while I served pasta from the pot. "Reminds me of you when you first started freelancing." I had laughed along then. Now, the echo of that laugh made me nauseous. 15 years of marriage, 2 children, a home we designed together, detail by detail. I had never imagined the end of us would begin with an email confirmation. I sat up slowly, the sheets falling away from my skin, suddenly too cold to offer comfort. The silence of our room was brutal. No hum of a TV, no Daniel's voice from the hallway, no illusion left to cling to. I whispered his name, not out of longing, but out of disbelief. My fingers trembled, but I forced them to move. I clicked the email. The more I read, the more my denial eroded, like a shoreline giving way to relentless waves. I remembered our honeymoon, Florence, Villa Cora, the scent of lavender in the sheets, the way the balcony caught the morning light. We had walked the cobbled streets with our fingers laced, stopping every few blocks to kiss like teenagers who believed love was enough to carry a lifetime. And now, he was returning to that sacred place, with her. I don't remember getting out of bed, only that I found myself downstairs moments later, barefoot, wrapped in a robe, staring at our espresso machine as if it could offer answers. Needed to do something. Anything. So I opened my laptop. I signed into our joint accounts. My body moved like it had done this before, like it was pre-programmed for betrayal, hotel reservations, Villa Cora, presidential suite, dinner for 2 at Il Palagio, a couple's massage at 9 a.m. Saturday, all prepaid, all under his name. My first instinct wasn't rage. It wasn't even sadness. It was clarity, cold, clean, ruthless, like a scalpel in a surgeon's hand. I knew right then that Daniel wasn't just having an affair. He was erasing me. And he was doing it elegantly, efficiently, like deleting a file from a drive. No explanation, no guilt, just removal. But I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to fall apart. I wasn't going to disappear. I was going to watch the man I married walk onto a plane with his mistress and smile, thinking he'd gotten away with it. And I was going to sit right beside him, first class, seat 1B. I was going to be the turbulence he never saw coming. I didn't cry that night. Instead, I created a folder on my desktop titled Operation Truth. Inside it, I saved the flight confirmation, the hotel booking, and a Word doc labeled Evidence Log. Every step of my heartbreak was going to be archived, not as a wound, but as a weapon. The rest of the house slept peacefully. The wind outside carried the sound of distant sirens, maybe a city in pain, mirroring mine. I made a cup of tea and stared at the steam curling upward, thinking about the woman I had become. When had I stopped dreaming? When had I settled for being invisible? Daniel's betrayal didn't destroy me. It woke me up. In that moment, I I knew. This wasn't about revenge. This was about reclaiming my identity. Shattered, buried beneath a decade of making excuses for a man who no longer saw me. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to confront him in a robe, mascara running. I was going to play his game. Better. He had underestimated me. They always do. The next morning, I kissed him goodbye like I always did. "Don't forget your protein bars," I said, handing him the bag I'd packed. He smiled like a man with nothing to fear, like a man with a clean getaway. I watched him drive away, not with tears, but with a plan. The clock had started ticking. I wasn't just going to see the affair with my own eyes. I was going to witness the moment his perfect lie crumbled into truth. I was going to watch him panic, trapped at 35,000 feet, realizing the woman he discarded had outsmarted him. And that, my dear Daniel, is the beginning of the end. If you're still here, I promise you, you don't want to miss how this ends. The truth, the takedown, the transformation, it's only just beginning. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to support this channel. The more love we get, the more jaw-dropping stories we'll bring your way. Now before we go, a quick question for you. If you discovered your partner booked a secret trip to Florence with someone else, would you A. Confront them at home right away, B. Follow them silently and execute a plan mid-air like Elena did? Comment your answer below, A or B, and let's talk in the comments. The days that followed were like walking through a play in which I was both the writer and the lead actress, performing with precision, pretending nothing had changed, while inside, everything had. I moved through the house with a grace that I hadn't summoned in years, not because I felt calm, but because I had finally found a reason to stop surrendering to the quiet disappointment that had settled into my bones. Daniel had no idea. Each morning, I woke up before him, made his coffee exactly the way he liked it, black, 1 sugar, cinnamon sprinkled on top, and kissed his cheek like a woman still devoted. He'd smile, touch my waist absently, and head off to work, oblivious that I was tracking every word, every move, every lie. I became the calm eye of a storm he hadn't noticed was forming. The plan started as instinct, but instinct sharpened, quickly into something else. Strategy. I needed information, documentation, and timing. I started with the bank accounts. Our joint funds had always been transparent, or so I thought. Daniel had once praised me for being too trusting to ever spy. He used to say it as a compliment. Now I saw it for what it was, an invitation to hide in plain sight. Using a VPN and the login to our home computer, which he left open far too often, I traced transfers from our joint account to a business expense fund. But instead of vendor, payments, or payroll, I found purchases that had nothing to do with business. Boutique hotel bookings, luxury spa payments, and a $1,200 dinner bill at a place in Amalfi I'd never even heard of. I documented each transaction. I saved PDF copies, organizing them by date, labeled in cold alphabetical folders. Still, I knew finances weren't enough. I needed faces. I needed moments that couldn't be denied. That's when I called Nadia. She had been my best friend since college, an artist, a single mother, and the fiercest advocate I'd ever known. We hadn't spoken as often in the last few years, our lives diverging as they often do, but she picked up on the second ring. "I need to tell you something," I said. An hour later, we were sitting in my living room, a bottle of Merlot between us, and my laptop open to the folder labeled Evidence. She listened in silence. When I finished, her only words were, "What's the plan?" By the end of the night, we had one. Nadia's cousin worked as a photographer in Italy, a street artist who also freelanced with fashion houses. Within 24 hours, he was looped in. His job would be simple: Trail Daniel and Isabel once they arrived in Florence. Take discreet photos. Send timestamps. I didn't just want to know what they were doing. I wanted undeniable proof of where, when, and how they did it. In love, details matter. In betrayal, they're everything. Next, I ordered a camera disguised as a brooch, a sleek black rose I could pin to my coat. It had a wide lens, clear audio, and enough battery to last a transatlantic flight. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel had once bragged about how he could always tell when someone was hiding something. I wondered how long it would take for him to notice the lens pointed straight at him. Then came the travel arrangements. I waited until he was at work before calling my travel agent. I hadn't used her in years, but she remembered me. Elena Parker, I said. I need a first-class ticket to Florence. Same flight as Daniel Parker. I want seat 1B. She hesitated for only a second. There's a 1A and 1C booked under his name and someone else. Looks like only 1B is open. Perfect. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. When I hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. And that clarity gave me strength. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about identity. It was about control. It was about refusing to let someone else write the ending to my story. Later that night, I lay in bed next to Daniel, pretending to sleep, listening to him breathe evenly, unaware that I'd just booked a seat next to the lie he thought he'd gotten away with. I spent the next few days gathering documents. I contacted a lawyer, Monica Bennett, a woman I had gone to grad school with years ago. She had built her own firm since then, specializing in high-asset divorces and financial fraud. We met in a discreet office downtown. I'm not filing yet, I told her. But I want to know what my options are. She didn't blink. She simply opened a legal pad and started taking notes. We spent 2 hours going through everything: the assets, the accounts, the evidence. I told her about the trip, about my plan to confront him mid-air with the documents she would help me prepare. You sure you want to do this on a plane? She asked. I'm sure I want him to feel like he can't run, I said. When I left her office, I had a manila folder tucked in my bag. Divorce papers, asset disclosures, a formal letter of resignation for Daniel to sign regarding his role. At the company we'd co-founded, everything he'd built on my quiet labor and sacrifice trust. It was all finally tangible. That night, Daniel made dinner. He lit candles, he poured wine. He said he'd be traveling for a strategic client summit and wouldn't be reachable for a few days. I asked, Florence? He froze for half a second. No, Chicago, I nodded. Take your coat. They're expecting snow. He smiled and kissed my forehead. The next morning, after he left for Chicago, I began packing. Not just clothes, but armor. I picked the emerald silk blouse he'd bought me on our 10th anniversary, a blazer tailored to my frame, the gold heels that always made me stand a little taller. I didn't pack for revenge. I packed for reclaiming. I called my sons, both away at boarding school, and told them I'd be visiting a friend for the weekend. They were used to my little escapes. They didn't question it. I didn't like lying. To them. But this wasn't a lie. It was an act of preservation. I booked a driver for the airport. I printed everything I needed. I went over every word of the documents again, imagining Daniel's face as he read them at 35,000 feet. I could almost hear him choking on the champagne. On the night before the flight, I didn't sleep. Instead, I walked room to room in our house, memorizing the life I was about to leave behind. The kitchen where I'd cooked countless dinners while he worked late. The hallway where he'd hung Emma's first watercolor painting. The bedroom we had shared. Once a sanctuary, now a stage. I stood in front of the mirror, my reflection steadier than I expected. You are not a victim, I whispered. You are the story. When the sun rose, I was ready. The car arrived. The driver smiled, made small talk. I smiled back. On the surface, I was just another well-dressed woman headed on a European getaway. But beneath the sunglasses and scarf was a woman who had spent the last week stitching together her broken self into something formidable. At the airport, I passed through security with my documents tucked inside a sleek black folder. My carry-on held only the essentials: lipstick, the brooch camera, and a travel-sized bottle of Daniel's favorite cologne. It wasn't for him. It was for me. To remind myself that even his favorite scent couldn't mask the stench of betrayal. At the gate, I ordered tea and waited. The boarding announcement came, and I stood, walking with purpose. As I stepped onto the jet bridge, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The silences, the nights he didn't come home, the sudden showers after dinner, the way he'd looked at his phone and smiled when he thought I wasn't looking. He thought I hadn't noticed. He thought I had vanished inside the routine of a life he no longer respected. But he was wrong. Because while Daniel flew to Florence with his mistress, believing he was escaping the confines of a broken marriage, I had planned my own flight, direct, strategic, devastating, and I had bought the seat right next to them. It was time for the truth to fly, and this time, it wouldn't need a parachute. The air inside the terminal pulsed with that peculiar tension airports always carry, an alchemy of haste, hope, and hush. I sat near gate B14, first-class boarding pass tucked securely in my coat pocket, watching travelers drift past like ghosts. Everyone around me seemed preoccupied with their own destination, their own story. No one could have guessed that mine would unfold midair. It was strange how calm I felt. My fingers didn't tremble. My breath didn't hitch. I had rehearsed every second of this encounter in my head for days, sometimes imagining fury, other times silence. But now, sitting quietly, waiting for the moment my husband and his mistress would arrive for their romantic escape, I felt only one thing: readiness. The airline attendant called for early boarding, and I moved with practiced ease. My heels clicked on the polished tile as I walked the jet bridge. The flight crew welcomed me with polite smiles, unaware that this wasn't a luxury trip. It was an act of war. Seat 1B. The middle of a neatly aligned row of 3 in the first-class cabin. Daniel and Isabel would be in 1A and 1C. I settled in, arranging my coat and scarf with deliberate elegance. I slipped the brooch camera into position, tilting the flower just enough to face where Daniel would sit. I ordered a glass of sparkling water, not because I wanted it, but because I needed my hands to be doing something. The flight attendants moved with their usual choreographed precision, their voices a gentle murmur behind the hum of boarding announcements. I had arrived before them. That, too, was intentional. I needed to be seated, composed, in place like a storm cell waiting to break. It wasn't long before I saw them. Daniel's silhouette appeared first in the jet bridge window, tall, unmistakable. His hand rested on Isabel's lower back with the kind of ease and ownership that made bile rise in my throat. She laughed at something he said, her head tilted toward him, adoration shining in her eyes. He had once looked at me that way. They entered the cabin with the swagger of people who believed they were untouchable. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I kept my posture serene, my gaze neutral as I sipped from my glass. Daniel scanned the seat numbers, pulling his carry-on behind him. When he reached row 1, he paused. I turned to face him. "Hello, Daniel," I said, my voice as calm and sharp as a knife gliding through silk. For a heartbeat, he didn't recognize me. Then the color drained from his face with stunning speed. His mouth opened and closed, soundless. I had never seen him speechless before. Not in 15 years. "Elena," he whispered. His hands fumbled with the strap of his bag. "What are you? How are you?" "Seat 1B, I said, holding up my boarding pass. "Right next to you. Imagine that. Isabel's confusion morphed into horror as recognition set in. Her cheeks flushed a deep crimson, and she looked to Daniel for some kind of salvation. He offered none. His eyes were locked on me, stunned, terrified. "You need to get off this plane," he said under his breath. "We'll talk later." The flight attendant, oblivious to the war about to unfold, smiled politely. "Sir, we're preparing for departure. Please take your seat." Daniel slid into 1C like a man walking toward his execution. His body was rigid, and his gaze flickered between me and the window. Isabel, trembling, took her place in 1A, shrinking against the wall. I waited until the crew was buckled in and the cabin doors sealed. The engines began their slow, ominous roll forward. There was no escape now. We were in the air together for the next 7 hours, and I had every intention of using every minute. "I know everything," I said, my voice quiet but unmistakable. He didn't respond at first. His jaw clenched. He reached for his drink with a hand that wasn't steady. "You don't know what you think you know," he muttered, keeping his eyes straight ahead. "I know about the hotel in Amalfi, the transfers from our joint account, the dinner at Il Palagio. I know about Isabel. I know about the 15 months of lies. I know that while I was paying our mortgage, you were reserving massages for 2 in Florence." Daniel's hand froze midair. Isabel let out a soft gasp. Her face was pale now, her confidence unraveling thread by thread. I pulled out the black folder from my carry-on and dropped it on his tray table. The flight attendant raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "What is this?" he asked. "Proof. Divorce papers, financial statements, a resignation letter for the company board. Signed copies will keep this private. Anything less, and it all goes public. Clients, investors, IRS, the whole thing." "You're bluffing." I leaned closer, lowering my voice so only he and Isabel could hear. "I have emails. I have the bank records. I have photos from Florence already waiting in a shared drive. And I have a lawyer who's more competent than you ever gave me credit for. You would ruin me. You were willing to ruin me," I said simply. "The only difference is I have receipts." He stared down at the folder like it was a live grenade. Isabel pressed her lips together, visibly shaking now. "You told me the funds were from a private account," she whispered. "You said it was all legitimate." He turned to her. "I didn't. Don't lie to her too," I cut in. "Or do. It doesn't matter anymore. She'll know soon enough." He didn't deny it. He didn't speak. The plane climbed higher, into the kind of silence only altitude can create. The engine's rumble became background noise to the reckoning happening in our row. The curtain between us and the rest of the cabin was closed. There was nowhere to run. "I don't want to go to court," I said. "But I will. I'll bring every file, every message, every charge." He was sweating now, not just from fear but from the understanding that I had outmaneuvered him. "What do you want?" he asked finally, defeated. "I want half the company. The house. I want full transparency on all remaining accounts. I want a private settlement. No court, no scandal, unless you resist." He looked at the documents, then at me, and then at Isabel, who had turned her body away from both of us, hugging herself as if trying to disappear. "You always said I was too emotional," I added. "But it turns out I was just learning how to be strategic." "You've been planning this?" "I've been surviving," I corrected. "There's a difference." He signed the papers at 38,000 feet. The pen I handed him, one with a discreet recording device, captured the entire exchange. His admissions, his silence, his shame. When the flight attendant returned to refill our drinks, she noticed the tension, but said nothing. "Can I offer anything else?" she asked. I smiled. "Just the check, please." 7 hours later, we landed in Florence. Isabel bolted from the plane like she couldn't breathe until she was away from both of us. Daniel stood at the gate, disoriented, humiliated, broken. I stepped past him with the same grace I'd entered the plane with. "You can keep the hotel," I said. "You paid for it. But I wouldn't use the company card anymore." He said nothing. I didn't look back. There was no need. Because in that skybound cabin, surrounded by lies and altitude, I had reclaimed the one thing he thought I'd forgotten: how to own my power. The flight may have carried us to Florence, but the truth had already landed. It's strange how 1 year can stretch like a lifetime and compress into a moment all at once. Time has a way of folding in on itself after a trauma, collapsing memory into fragments you must decide whether to keep, reshape, or discard entirely. It's been 12 months since that flight to Florence, 12 months since I watched Daniel's hands tremble as he signed away our life at 38,000 feet. I didn't return to Boston after that trip. I landed back in the States the next morning and drove straight to Savannah, Georgia, where my aunt had left me a small cottage years earlier. I'd never intended to live in it. It had been more of a sentimental inheritance, something quiet and southern and far away. But when I stepped inside that first day, with the soft hum of cicadas and the scent of salt drifting off the river, I understood something. Florence had been my reckoning. Savannah would be my resurrection. The first few weeks were disorienting. Grief came not in loud sobs, but in stillness. I would wake at dawn, unsure of what day it was, pour a cup of coffee and just sit, watching the marsh shift with the light. The quiet was overwhelming at first. I had spent so many years filling every silence with effort, pleasing, managing, explaining, forgiving. Now, I had no one to perform for, no one to protect, only myself. And I barely knew how. But there is something sacred about rebuilding alone. There is honesty in solitude. I began relearning myself not in grand gestures, but in tiny decisions. Repainting the kitchen cabinet sea glass green, saying no to people who drained me, deciding not to answer emails after 6 p.m. I stopped apologizing for things I didn't break. I took long walks without a destination, and slowly, I began to feel like someone real again. I changed my name back to Elena Hale. It was a quiet decision, one that felt like reclaiming a room in a house I had rented to someone else for too long. My father's name, my own name. I had given up more than I realized when I took Daniel's. Not just identity, but autonomy. It wasn't that I hated who I was as Elena Parker, but I knew she had gotten lost somewhere. I owed it to myself to go back and find her. Daniel, predictably, did not handle the fallout well. In the immediate aftermath of our flight, his position at the company crumbled. Word traveled fast in the circles that mattered. Investors who once courted him suddenly kept their distance. Employees who once admired him began resigning, citing ethical discomfort. The resignation letter I made him sign was processed within days, not out of pity, but out of pragmatism. They needed to sever him cleanly. I heard through the grapevine, mostly via Nadia, who had sources everywhere, that he moved to Phoenix, took a consulting job with a distant cousin. The golden boy of Boston Tech, now managing back-end systems for dental offices. Isabel didn't follow him. She left him at the hotel lobby in Florence, hours after realizing just how deep his deception ran. Apparently, the woman who smiled at me over my dinner table didn't appreciate being lied to about offshore accounts either. I thought I would feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt done. Finished with that version of the story. Revenge had never been my true goal. What I wanted was peace, space, truth. And I had them now. My sons took longer to understand, especially Liam, my oldest. At 19, he still held his father on a pedestal that even Florence couldn't topple overnight. When I first told him about the divorce, he asked questions that cut deep. Couldn't you have tried harder? And are you sure this isn't a misunderstanding? I answered every one of them with compassion, not because Daniel deserved protection, but because Liam deserved to arrive at his own truth without inheriting my bitterness. Eventually, the reckoning came. Liam had returned home for spring break. I had left my laptop open while uploading files to my new consulting website. He saw the folder, Evidence Archive. He clicked. I wish I'd been more careful, but maybe I hadn't wanted to be. Maybe I needed him to see. That night, he came into the kitchen holding the laptop, tears in his eyes. I read the emails, he said, voice breaking. Dad lied. To you, to me, to all of us. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say anything. I just pulled him into my arms and held him the way I did when he was 5 and had nightmares about falling. We cried together, mourning not just a marriage, but a myth. And from that night on, our healing began in tandem. 6 months ago, I launched a new business, Hale & Kober Consulting, a boutique firm specializing in financial literacy and empowerment for women navigating divorce or financial abuse. I didn't start it to prove anything. I started it because I knew what it was like to sit in silence, holding a broken heart in one hand and a stack of legal papers in the other, unsure of how to begin again. My first client was a woman named Jill, a nurse from Atlanta whose husband had emptied their retirement accounts and fled to Belize. She sat across from me shaking, convinced she was too broken to recover. I told her what I had learned the hard way, that healing doesn't come all at once, and strength isn't something you feel. It's something you choose. Within months, I had a roster of women like Jill. Different names, same story. Betrayal, confusion, erasure. Some were angry, some were numb. All were brilliant in ways they hadn't been told. And every single one of them reminded me why I had survived. Nadia became my partner in the venture. She ran the creative and community building side, organizing monthly salons in Savannah, where women could come to share their stories, laugh, cry, eat homemade lasagna, and remember who they were before the gaslighting. We didn't just run a company. We ran a quiet rebellion. I kept the house in Boston for a while, but eventually sold it. Too many rooms held echoes I no longer wanted to live with. Too many shadows on the staircase. I used the money to buy a small 2-bedroom on the edge of Savannah's historic district, with creaky wood floors and a clawfoot tub I soak in every Sunday. It's not big, but it's mine. Every inch of it. Last week I received a package with no return address. Inside was a copy of The Alchemist, the corners folded, a note inside in Daniel's handwriting. I should have read this when you gave it to me. I think I finally understand. I'm sorry. D. I closed the book, placed it on the shelf, and left it there. Some things need no reply. As for me, I've begun to travel again. Not to chase ghosts or confront betrayal, but to reclaim places that were once tainted. 2 months ago, I flew to Florence, not to spy, not to confront, but to walk the streets on my own terms. I visited Villa Cora again. This time I stayed alone. I ordered espresso on the same balcony where Daniel once promised forever. I laughed, I cried, and I wrote a letter to myself. Not the Elena from the flight, not the wife, not the woman with a plan, but to the girl who once believed she had to earn love to deserve peace. I told her, "You are enough. You always were." And when I flew home, I didn't look over my shoulder. I carried nothing but light. There are places that carry the memory of heartbreak like smoke clinging to the walls long after the fire is gone. Florence was once that place for me. For years, even the name of the city brought a tightening to my chest, a reminder of a promise shattered, of laughter stolen, of a love that didn't survive its own lies. But time has a way of sanding down, sharp edges, of offering back what we thought was lost. Not in the way it was, but in the way it was always meant to be. That is why I returned. This time, I flew alone. There were no hidden cameras in my bag, no documents tucked into folders, no secrets to reveal. Just a worn leather journal, a favorite scarf, and a sense of self I had spent the last year carefully rebuilding. The plane landed early in the morning, and as I stepped off into the cool Tuscan air, I didn't feel like a woman confronting ghosts. I felt like a woman arriving home. The city was unchanged, its timeless beauty untouched by my personal history. The dome still glowed in the morning light, the cobblestones still echoed beneath every step. But I had changed, and that made all the difference. I checked into a small boutique hotel nestled on the south side of the Arno River, far from the tourist-heavy districts. The kind of place where you're greeted with real espresso and silence is treated as luxury. From my window, I could see the Ponte Vecchio stretching across the river, just as it had years ago when Daniel and I walked across it hand in hand, talking about our dreams. Now I watched it alone, and I didn't feel the absence of his hand. I felt the presence of my own. The first day, I wandered without a plan. I let the city unfold like a story I was reading again for the first time. I stopped at a tiny bookshop near Santa Croce, run by a woman named Lucia, who insisted I take a copy of a poetry collection by an unknown Florentine poet. "You look like someone who needs to read something beautiful," she said. She was right. That evening, I found myself on the rooftop terrace of a quiet wine bar, watching the sun sink behind the Duomo. The air was crisp, the wine earthy and deep. I pulled out my journal and began to write. Not about Daniel, not about Florence, but about this new version of myself, the woman who had learned to live without apologies, who had discovered joy in solitude, who had finally made peace with the idea that closure wasn't something others gave you. It was something you gave yourself. Halfway through the second glass of Chianti, a man sat down at the far end of the terrace. I noticed him only because he ordered in Italian with the ease of a local, then pulled out a dog-eared novel I had read in college. He looked up at me once, nodded politely, then returned to his book. There was no charge in the air, no cinematic moment of chemistry. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who had each come to Florence alone. His name was Henry, a literature professor from Edinburgh, widowed, here to lecture for a short-term program. We spoke briefly, sharing thoughts on Dante and the strange beauty of cities that hold your history. He didn't ask why I was there, and I didn't offer. There was something freeing in being seen not as a woman who had survived something, but simply as a woman who was here. Over the next few days we met occasionally, by chance or by rhythm, I'm still not sure. A shared cappuccino one morning. A walk through the Boboli Gardens another afternoon. There was no pursuit, no performance, just presence. He asked good questions. He listened well. And most importantly, he never asked about Daniel. I spent one full morning at Villa Cora. I had reserved the same suite we had once stayed in. It was more than indulgence. It was reclamation. I stood on the balcony, the same one where Daniel had once whispered that we'd always return to Florence. The irony didn't sting anymore. I leaned against the railing, let the breeze tangle my hair, and read the poems Lucia had given me. One line struck me so deeply, I copied it into my journal. "You are not what was taken from you. You are what you chose to build from what remained." I thought about the women I had worked with over the last year. Jill, who had just bought her first house on her own. Patrice, who started a baking business after leaving her controlling ex. Samantha, who had just signed up for her first solo trip to Thailand. They were part of something now. A quiet network of women who had learned through pain how to rebuild. I had helped them find that strength. And in doing so, They had helped me find mine. On my final night in Florence, I hosted a small gathering, a retreat I had organized through Hale & Co. for 6 of my former clients who had all gone through their own divorces and rediscoveries. We met in a private room above a cafe, the windows thrown open to the sound of the city at night. There was laughter, clinking glasses, tears that didn't require explanation. Each woman stood and shared something she had reclaimed: her voice, her finances, her space, her hope. When it was my turn, I stood quietly for a moment before saying, "Florence was once the scene of my undoing. Now it's the backdrop of my freedom. It reminds me that we can rewrite the meaning of any place, any memory, if we choose to." When the evening ended, I walked home slowly, the streets glowing under the warm halo of streetlights. Henry was sitting on the steps of the piazza near my hotel, a book in his lap, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked up, offered a soft smile. I sat beside him without a word. We didn't speak for a long time. We didn't need to. And I realized in that silence that my greatest victory had never been about the confrontation on the plane, or the settlement, or even the business I'd built. It was this: being able to sit beside a man, unguarded and unafraid, no longer defined by the hurt someone else had caused. I wasn't looking for love. I wasn't even looking for closure. I had simply come home to myself. As the bells of the city chimed midnight, I thought of Liam and our younger son, Evan, who had just sent me a photo of his first day as a high school intern. I thought of Nadia, who was preparing to launch a podcast for women starting over. I thought of all the versions of myself I had outgrown, and I thanked every one of them, because they had survived, because they had kept walking, because they had bought a seat beside the truth and dared to stay until the end of the flight. Some people say living well is the best revenge, but I've come to believe something deeper. Living authentically is the greatest freedom. To stand in your own story, to walk through the city of your heartbreak and call it beautiful again. That is power. That is peace. And that, finally, is mine. Elena's journey was never just about betrayal. It was about identity, silence, awakening, and ultimately, transformation. What began with a 3 a.m. notification, just a few lines of text confirming a secret flight, sparked a quiet but unstoppable revolution in one woman's life. That moment, drenched in heartbreak and disbelief, became the first thread she pulled from a carefully woven illusion, and as she pulled, everything unraveled. For 15 years, Elena had been the steady figure behind her husband Daniel's success, a quiet force, a devoted wife, a patient mother, a woman who had slowly and silently handed over pieces of herself for the sake of stability, family, and what she thought was love. But betrayal, when it comes not with rage but with calculation, exposes not just the truth about others, but the truths we have ignored about ourselves. She could have screamed. She could have begged. She could have fallen apart and become the cliché, the humiliated wife left behind, but she didn't. Instead, Elena chose silence, not the passive kind, but the powerful kind. The kind that listens, plans, prepares. The kind that turns pain into strategy and heartbreak into resolve. She sat beside Daniel and his mistress on that flight to Florence, not to confront for drama, but to reclaim her agency. Every choice she made was measured, intentional. She wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. She wanted truth, dignity, and control over her own narrative. And she got it. But the real story didn't end at 38,000 feet. It began after landing. In the year that followed, Elena didn't just survive, she evolved. She left behind the woman who was constantly proving her worth and stepped into someone who no longer needed permission to take up space. She built a business not to flaunt success, but to uplift women walking the same painful road she once walked barefoot. She mended the broken trust between her and her sons, piece by piece, with honesty and grace. She returned to Florence, not to haunt her past, but to heal it. She stood in the same places where her world once cracked and discovered they no longer held power over her. Elena's greatest victory was not what she took from Daniel. It was what she gave back to herself, her voice, her vision, her value. This story isn't just about infidelity. It's about awakening from emotional invisibility. It's about how betrayal doesn't define us. Our response to it does. And that leads us to the most important takeaway. You cannot control whether someone lies to you, cheats on you, or tries to erase you. But you can control whether they succeed. You can choose silence, but make it strategic. You can choose kindness, but not submission. You can choose to walk away, not out of defeat, but in absolute clarity that staying would cost you more than leaving ever will. In our world today, where many suffer quietly through broken relationships, manipulated loyalty, or self-doubt rooted in someone else's disrespect, Elena's journey reminds us of something vital. Our worth is not tied to how others treat us. It's tied to how we respond when they don't. Whether you've faced infidelity, emotional neglect, gaslighting, or simply the slow erosion of yourself in someone else's shadow, this story is for you. Not as a blueprint for revenge, but as proof that you can rise, that healing is not only possible, but powerful, and that reclaiming your life is the most poetic ending you can ever write. And now, a quick reflection for you. If you found yourself in Elena's shoes, what would you do? A. Forgive quietly and move on without confrontation. B. Confront with grace and reclaim your power like Elena did. Type your answer. A or B in the comments. Let's hear your thoughts. And beyond that, how do you interpret Elena's choices? Was she right to confront on the plane? Would you have handled it differently? Share your perspective in the comments. Your voice could inspire someone else who's in the middle of their own story right now. If you were moved, shocked, or inspired by this story, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Your support helps us bring more true to life, emotional, and empowering content your way. Until next time, remember, the truth always flies higher.